Welcome back to Tech Unplugged, everyone. Today we're diving deep into, well, securing those large language models, those LLMs and AI applications that are, becoming more and more a part of what everybody's doing.
That's right. Yeah.
And we've been doing a lot of research, gathering all sorts of information on this. It's such a quickly developing, evolving field.
Yeah.
And we really want to just kind of pull out those key takeaways, help you really understand this landscape of AI security without maybe feeling overwhelmed by all the technical stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And one thing we're going to really zero in on today is this idea of a firewall for AI, or what some people are calling an LLM firewall,
Hmm.
kind of looking at why just the typical security measures that you might already have in place, why those might not be quite enough,
Right.
and then how these specialized firewalls are being designed to specifically kind of step in and protect your AI work, as you're doing all this cool new stuff.
Yeah. And I think a key point to start with is unlike traditional applications where you have, data and what we call the control logic, what's telling the data what to do, very separate. With LLMs, it's like the rules are kind of baked into the data. It's all kind of intertwined.
Yeah.
And that really changes the game when it comes to security because those perimeter defenses that we're used to, they're not really looking at the right things.
Right, right. So they're missing the point. They're not even looking in the right place, I guess.
Exactly. It's like they're checking passports at the border, but not really understanding what's inside the packages.
Right, right. Exactly. And this is a big shift, right? I mean, we've been securing applications for a long time. What makes LLMs so different, like from that security perspective? What makes them such a different beast?
Well, think about, your typical web application. You've got, say, data in a database, and then you have your application code. And that code is like a set of instructions. It tells the data what to do.
Right.
And the traditional firewalls we have, they're mainly operating at that network level. They're looking at traffic, things like IP addresses, the ports that are being used. It's
Right.
like, they're monitoring the roads and the highways, but
Yeah.
they're not really looking at who's driving the cars or what's being
Mhm.
transported, right?
Right.
And those traditional firewalls, they're essentially, enforcing the rules that are set by the application's control logic, that separate piece of code.
Okay.
Now, LLMs, it's a whole different ballgame. First of all, they're non-deterministic. So the
Hmm.
same input you give them, it can actually lead to different outputs each time because of the way they're using probabilities.
Interesting.
But what's even more important for security is, the data they're trained on, all that data and how they actually create their responses. It's all kind of intertwined. It's not like a separate, easily defined piece of code that you can just go in and say, okay, this is what's controlling everything. It's kind of spread out. It's embedded in the way the model itself is structured, shaped by that massive amount of training data, the parameters they've been given, all of that.
So it's almost like the potential for unexpected behavior. It's not just a bug. It's baked into how the model works.
Exactly, yeah. And what that means for security is the risks, they're not just from, someone trying to hack in from the outside, but they can also come from the way the model itself processes language and generates text.
Oh,
Like
wow.
you could ask it a seemingly innocent question and it could spit out something that's totally off base or, gives away some sensitive information, even if it wasn't supposed to. And your traditional firewall, it wouldn't even recognize that as a problem.
Wow, that's almost a little scary. So it's like we're trying to use old tools to solve new problems almost.
Yeah, kind of. And that's really where this LLM firewall comes in. That's
Hmm.
kind of its role.
Right. So what exactly does an LLM firewall do? How does it kind of fit into this whole new landscape that we're dealing with?
Okay, so basically it's like a specialized kind of intermediary. It sits between your application or even your users and the large language model.
Okay.
And its job is to, well, it monitors and analyzes the prompts that are being sent to the AI and then the responses that the AI generates. It's looking at the content, like what's being said, but also the context, like what's the situation, what's the meaning behind the words.
So it's not just a traditional firewall that's kind of, been taught a few AI tricks.
No, not at all. While some of those traditional firewalls are starting to use AI for things like anomaly detection, an LLM firewall is really built from the ground up to understand those unique risks that come with these large language models.
Okay. Yeah.
It's about language, it's about understanding context, it's not just about those network traffic patterns that we talked about.
Right. Right. That's really interesting. And if, let's say I wanted to actually implement one of these, like how would that work? Where would it fit in with all my existing systems and stuff.
Well, the way you'd usually do it and what's generally recommended for, flexibility and integrating it with, your development processes is through an API.
Okay.
So your applications, they'd basically make these API calls to this LLM firewall service. And then the firewall, it looks at the prompt, make sure everything's okay before it sends it on to the actual LLM. And then it checks the response that comes back before it sends it back to you.
Right.
There are also, SDKs, so that's software development kits, and they let you kind of embed this functionality right into your applications, which is, can be handy.
Yeah.
And some of them even work as what's called a reverse proxy. So that's like it sits in the network between your users and the AI service, kind of like a gatekeeper.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's really useful for more general control, like if you need to manage how many requests are coming in, things like that.
Right. So it's like this kind of, dedicated security layer almost that's just focused on those AI interactions that you have.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier about all these different kinds of risks that we're
Yeah.
talking about. Like, what are the specific threats that these LLM firewalls are really built to deal with? What are we actually talking about here?
Well, one of the, I guess, the biggest worries is what's called model abuse, and in particular, this thing called prompt injection.
Okay.
And this is basically where they figure out a really clever way to word a prompt to trick the LLM into doing something it's not supposed to do.
Well,
And this can be anything from, getting it to bypass its ethical guidelines, maybe produce some kind of, inappropriate content, to even more serious stuff.
Yeah.
If the LLM is connected to other systems, like through tools like LangChain, which is used for those, really complex AI workflows, then a successful prompt injection attack, well, it could even make the AI do things that are actually harmful on those connected systems.
oh, God.
Like deleting data or running commands that it shouldn't be allowed to do.
Wow. So that's a huge vulnerability then. I mean, how do the LLM firewalls actually protect against these prompt injection attacks? How does that actually work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And honestly, the solutions for this they're always, changing. They're always being developed and updated. A lot of them right now, they rely on a mix of, well, rules, kind of preset things that they look for and these
Yeah.
things called heuristics. And that's basically like, patterns that they've identified that are, kind of suspicious, things that might indicate that someone's trying to pull something funny. So, for example, they might look for specific keywords, certain phrases that are often used in these what they call jailbreak attacks, where they're trying to get around the safety mechanisms that are built into the model.
Interesting.
But it's an ongoing challenge, and there's no, perfect answer yet.
Right, right. It's an evolving problem and therefore an evolving solution.
Exactly.
Exactly. And another thing, that I've heard a lot about, with these LLMs is the potential for them to generate, content that's harmful or toxic, stuff that you just don't want out there. So how do the firewalls help with that kind of, content moderation?
Yeah, that's a real concern for sure. LLMs, they can unfortunately, sometimes they produce stuff that's, offensive or discriminatory, just plain harmful. And those LLM firewalls, they integrate, content moderation techniques, things like sentiment analysis. They try to detect and filter out this kind of output before it ever gets to the user.
Right.
But it's actually a really tough job because, language is so subtle and context matters so much. And even different cultures have different ideas about what's acceptable and what's not.
Right, right.
So what might be, totally fine in one situation could be really, problematic in another.
Right. And these things they're kind of tough for even humans to sort through sometimes.
Exactly.
And then there's also, the whole issue of sensitive data. And I can imagine, situations where an LLM might accidentally reveal confidential information, maybe something get picked up during training or just because of some processing error.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a legitimate concern?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a big one. And that's where these LLM firewalls can really be, a lifesaver. They can be set up to actually filter out and redact sensitive data, both in the prompts going into the LLM and in the responses coming out.
Oh, wow.
And what's really cool is they're starting to use more and more AI-powered techniques within these firewalls to do this.
Okay.
And these AI-driven methods, well, they can often, understand the meaning and the context of the information so much better than those older, rule-based systems that just, they might miss something important or, flag too many things that are actually
So
harmless.
it's not just about looking for keywords. It's about really understanding, the meaning behind the information.
Exactly. And while all of this is going on, the LLM firewalls are focused on these AI-specific risks, but we can't forget that the applications that use LLMs, they're still vulnerable to, those regular web-based attacks, things like DDoS
Right.
attacks, that can just flood a system with so much traffic that it crashes. Luckily, traditional firewalls are still really good at dealing with those.
Okay, that's good. That's good to hear. So it's like a multi-layered, approach here. You need both kinds of security. So this sounds like, it could get a little complicated, a lot of responsibility.
Mhm.
Who's ultimately in charge of making sure these AI systems are secure? Is it me as the user? Is it the company that made the LLM? Like who's got to make sure this all works?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of brings us to this concept of shared responsibility in AI security.
Okay.
It's kind of like, how things work with cloud services.
Mhm.
So the company that made the LLM, they're responsible for, making sure their infrastructure is secure, that their platform is secure, that kind of thing.
Right.
But as the organization or the person using the AI, you're responsible for your own data, the applications you build with it, and how you actually interact with it.
So they make sure their house is secure, but I have to make sure I lock my doors when I go in.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's why these third-party services like the LLM firewalls we've been talking about, they're so valuable because they give you this extra layer of protection that's specifically for handling your side of the
Oh, yeah.
responsibility, particularly when it comes to, making sure that no sensitive data gets to the LLM in the first place and that the outputs from the AI, they fit with your own security policies. That this is super important for, keeping control of your confidential information and meeting any compliance requirements that might be out there.
Right, right. It all makes sense. So if I'm actually out there, shopping for an LLM firewall, what are some of the key features that I should be looking for? What are the must-haves, so to speak?
Well, given that, most of these are deployed through APIs, you'll usually find features that are, really geared towards developers and also for handling a ton of interactions. So things like, attack signature identification, which basically means
Hmm.
it can recognize, known bad patterns and prompts.
Right. Yeah.
Rate limiting, which can help prevent those, denial of service attacks, the ones that try to overload your systems.
Yeah.
And then also really strong sensitive data detection. And that's important both for, your own data that you're using, but also for any user data that might be going through, public LLMs.
Okay.
So, a lot to think about.
And are there different types of LLM firewalls, that are kind of designed for specific parts of that AI interaction, I guess? Like are they all kind of doing the same thing or are there different flavors, so to speak?
Yeah, people usually categorize them based on, where in that whole interaction they're focused. So you've got, the prompt firewall, and that's the one that's looking at the incoming prompts, checking for things like, malicious code or those jailbreak attempts we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Then there's the response firewall, and that one analyzes the outputs from the LLM, looking for any kind of toxic language, sensitive information, or even just whether the response actually makes sense, if it's
Hmm.
actually relevant to the question that was asked.
Right.
And for people who are using RAG, that's retrieval augmented generation, where they're using external data to, give the LLM more knowledge. There's a specific firewall for that too, called a retrieval firewall. And that one focuses on, making sure the data that's being pulled in is, relevant and it doesn't have any sensitive information that shouldn't be shared.
Right, right. So it's kind of like, you're building security into every single step of that conversation, that back and forth with the AI. It's a really, thorough approach.
hmm
But are there any limitations, to these firewalls? I mean, are there any, potential downsides to relying on them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that's really important to think about. While those LLM firewalls are a big step forward, some people are saying that, they might not be a complete solution, especially as companies really start to scale up their AI stuff.
Okay.
One thing is, cost. If you're dealing with millions or even billions of interactions with LLMs, the cost of checking every single one through a third-party firewall, it can get really high.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, you're adding an extra step to every single interaction. That's going to add up.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's also the potential for, it to mess with the user experience a bit. If the
Yep.
firewall is, too strict, it might end up flagging things that are perfectly okay.
Right.
Like what we call false positives. And that can be really annoying for users and slow things down.
Right, right. Nothing more frustrating than, being blocked when you're trying to get something done.
Exactly. And another thing to consider is that the LLM firewalls right now, they might not give, the security teams all the information they need to really understand and deal with threats. They might tell you something was blocked, but not necessarily give you the full picture or the tools to dig deeper.
Okay.
And finally, the scope of some LLM firewalls, it might be a little limited. They might be mainly focused on that direct interaction with the LLM, but maybe missing some vulnerabilities in the systems around it, like in those complex RA pipelines or agent architectures we talked about.
Right.
And they might not be as good at dealing with attacks that use, different kinds of data, like images and text together, or attacks that are in different languages.
Right, right. So it's a layer of defense, but it's not like, a magic solution that fixes everything.
That's it, yeah. It's kind of like, thinking back to the early days of what they call CASBs, Cloud Access Security Brokers, which were all about securing cloud applications.
Right.
And at first, everyone was, really focused on real-time inspection of all the traffic, to prevent data loss. But then as the cloud, really took off and everyone was using it, these real-time approaches, they couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
And so now we're seeing more, asynchronous approaches where they're logging and monitoring things kind of in the background. So it kind of makes you wonder if we might see something similar happen with LLM security.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. So if LLM firewalls, you know, they're not they're not the whole story.
Hmm.
What are some other things, some other strategies that, companies and individuals should be thinking about? What else can we do to kind of, bolster that security?
Well, a big one that's, really relevant to AI is this idea of zero trust security. And basically that means you treat every interaction with an LLM as potentially risky, and you put in really strict verification and authorization at each step.
Got it.
So that could be, implementing these AI gateways that act as kind of protectors,
Yeah.
Not just analyzing content, but really controlling who can even access and use the AI in the first place.
Right, right.
And then you've also got things like data loss prevention, DLP capabilities that are being built specifically for, LLM requests.
Okay.
So that allows, organizations to automatically, hide or redact sensitive data in those prompts and responses.
Okay.
And beyond these, kind of immediate controls, you really need to be continuously monitoring how the AI is being used.
Yeah.
You need those automated threat prevention systems that can kind of learn and adapt as new threats pop up.
Right.
And then there's this new thing called AI security posture management, which gives you this, big picture view of, all the AI that's being used in your organization and any, potential security risks.
Okay.
It's also worth mentioning that there are a lot of open source LLM firewall toolkits becoming available now, which are great because they make these security technologies more accessible to developers.
Right. So it really sounds like you need a whole multi-layered security strategy. It's not just about one technology or one approach. It's about, bringing it all together.
Exactly. Yeah. And that kind of brings us back to why these LLM firewalls are so important in the first place. Those traditional firewalls, they're great for, network security, but they just don't get human language.
Yeah.
They can't look at a prompt or a response and understand, what it really means, the context, the intent behind it. And that's what LLM firewalls are designed to do.
So it's like trying to understand a movie just by listening to how loud the soundtrack is. You're missing all the nuances, the actual story.
That's a great analogy, yeah. You need tools that actually get what's being said, and that's the core value of these LLM firewalls. But at the end of the day, to really have strong security for LLMs, you need a bunch of different things working together. Those specialized firewalls, clear security policies, constant monitoring and threat detection, and really a sense of shared responsibility between you and the companies that provide those AI services.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive, I think, into the world of LLM firewalls and, all the security challenges and solutions that are kind of popping up in this space. It's clear that as these, large language models become more and more a part of everything we do, having this kind of intelligent and nuanced approach to security, well, it's just absolutely essential.
Absolutely, yeah. You should now have a much better understanding of why, the old ways of doing security, they don't always work with AI and how important these AI firewalls are for, dealing with all these new risks from those, prompt injections to data leaks to, harmful content being generated.
And as you continue to explore, you know, all the cool things you can do with AI,
Mhm.
remember, security can't be an afterthought. It has to be baked in from the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's got to be a core part of how you develop and use these AI applications.
Yeah. And remember this whole field of AI security, it's moving so fast. New challenges and solutions are popping up all the time. So, stay informed. Think about how these concepts apply to your own work with AI and check out the different security solutions that are out there.
Well, thank you for tuning in to Tech Unplugged, and we'll see you next time. Stay curious and stay secure.